evening and welcome to our first live episode of our ACEs conversation series. Tonight, we discuss ACEs and human rights. Now, for many people, and probably on this vodcast as well, human rights and ACEs may be a surprising frame. However, we hope that more will be revealed in the next 60 minutes. Remember, please do join in the conversation on the chat facility on Zoom, and remember those hashtags so we can see your comments on Twitter. Love you to join in the conversation. Some of you tonight on the watching this may remember the groundbreaking events held in Glasgow in 2018 and 2019 with the conferences that we held in Glasgow when we brought Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris to Scotland, and then in 2019 Gabor Mate, and we had a fantastic, sellout audiences. We had well over 2,000 people plus attending each event, and ever since then the ACE Aware Nation movement has gone from strength to strength to strength, and it really had the organizers thinking, well, what can we do in 2020, bearing in mind the situation that we find ourselves in with regard to COVID and not being able to travel, but not even COVID could stop this conversation. So this is why we've decided to host this series of events for the next 6 months. So hopefully you can join us for every one of those. So we're a truly international audience tonight. Hello, UK, hello, America, hello, Canada, and hello, Europe. So on to our guests now, the real stars of our show. Juliet Harris is the director of Together, the Scottish Alliance for Children's Rights, and Mary Glasgow is the CEO of Children First, Scotland's national children's charity. So good evening to you, Juliet. First of all, hello, good evening, welcome. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Edinburgh. A very miserable night in Edinburgh, actually.
Well, it's really good to see you. And Mary Glasgow, where we are not strangers to each other. I've had the honour of introducing you at the conference, and yeah, wow, here we are now in 2020, and the conversation, the ACE Aware Nation conversation continues. How are you, and where are you joining us from tonight, Mary?
I'm well, Gary, thanks. Lovely to see you again. And I am joining from a very dark, rainy, miserable Glasgow. Some light and sunshine to this conversation. Really looking forward to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Juliet, if I could start with you, could you tell me a little bit, first of all, about your organisation Together?
Yeah, certainly. So Together is the Scottish Alliance for Children's Rights. And we're an alliance of children's organisations, of professionals, of academics who all have a vision of a Scotland where all children and young people have their rights respected and protected and fulfilled. So among our membership, we have Children First, we have Mary Glasgow's organisation, we have UNICEF and kind of the well-known household names like Save the Children and Barnardo's. But we also include a lot of after-school clubs and play groups. We include social workers, we include teachers. So it's really anybody with a passion for making sure that children's rights are fulfilled and that children's human dignity is at the heart of everything they do. They join us as members. I can do a little bit of a plug here as well. But if anybody on this call wants to join Together, then just go to our website and do join us, because we're really keen just to have as many kind of human rights defenders on board as we possibly can.
Wonderful. That's great, Juliet. And plug away, feel free, as many as you want tonight, no problem. And Mary, for those who don't know, tell me a little bit about Children First.
Okay, so Children First is a charity working across Scotland, nationally and locally. And we work with children and their families and have two key aims really and purposes. The first is to support children to live safely within their own families and communities. So we offer a whole range of supports to parents, to children, to make sure that relationships are strong and that families get the support they need to recover from adversity in childhood, which is why we're so passionate about ACEs and what difference that's made to children in Scotland. But we also have another aim, which is to create the conditions in Scotland within policy, within legislation, culturally, within values of citizens that are interested in children's lives, to promote really this recognition and understanding that if we get it right for children in a country, then that gets it right for everybody. It's much better for everybody if we build strong countries with strong families and strong children. So a dual aim, and really one is about policy and practice and the other one is about the delivery of direct support to children.
And Mary, you've been on the ACE Aware Nation journey for many years now, along with other organisations who are joining us tonight, because it's not all about the ACE Aware Nation organisation. It's about a number of organisations, because we know it's very much community-led here in Scotland. How do you feel that the movement is going? Do you think it's heading in the right direction? Is it gaining traction since we've had the conferences, the international guests, and to where we are tonight?
I think that's a fantastic place to start, and probably a good conversation starter for Juliet and I, because I think we've come such a long way in Scotland in the conversation. So in some ways, for us at Children First, we've been around for 135 years. I think I've said this before at ACE Aware Nation events. We've long been exercised about how do we prevent harm to children, how do we prevent adversity in childhood, how do we support parents, adults and children to recover from that adversity, how do we take a rights-based approach to doing that. And I often joke, but it's not really a joke, that it's taken us 135 years and that we were never as effective as that initial film, the resilience film that Connected Baby and Partners showed 3 or 4 years ago. And so since then, I think what we've done is we've seen a raising of awareness through ACE Aware Nation. I think there's definitely far more professionals and parents that are involved in children's lives that understand why that matters. I think we've also seen some fascinating conversations and some challenge and some pushback about whether or not focusing on adversity in childhood and what's happened to children and to families and to adults is a good thing, or maybe something that keeps people, or is predeterministic and doesn't really help people have agency. The first thing I would say is that I'm just delighted that we're having this conversation. I've always said, we've been around for 135 years, and here it is in 3 or 4 years, we've made this massive leap forward where everybody's talking, everybody's concerned, everybody's interested. I think everybody on whatever lens they've put on this agrees that the single biggest thing we can do for children is prevent harm in childhood. That would be a good thing for all of us. And I think we've made huge strides. I think we're at an interesting place. I think there's been some challenge and some pushback and some interpretation about Scotland's approach to becoming ACE aware. And I just find it amazing that we're having that conversation. I welcome some of those challenges, and I don't think it's one thing or the other. I think this is an intersection of ideas and challenges that we're working through in order to get to a really good place where we build a country where children are valued, our culture recognises that, and we build systems that are around them that are protective but also allow for recovery.
And Juliet, tonight we're looking at ACEs through a human rights lens, but does the opposite work? Do you look at human rights through an ACEs lens?
I think that ACEs do provide a really kind of powerful tool to raise awareness and advocate for children and young people's rights. And certainly when you look at the ACEs framework, then it really does cover so many aspects that are included within the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so, I mean, everything that we do is through the lens of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it's all about making sure that children's rights are promoted, making sure they're protected, and making sure that they're fulfilled. And I know, I mean, there are actually 42 substantive rights, so 42 specific rights for children and young people within the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think that the ACEs movement has done a really good job at raising awareness of some of these rights. So, for example, like Article 19 of the UNCRC, I did promise not to get too geeky, so I won't quote them all, but Article 19 of the UNCRC really sets out in international law how children and young people have the right to be protected from violence. And that is obviously so key to the ACEs approach. There's Article 9, which is the right of the child not to be separated from their parents in most cases, unless it's in their best interest. Obviously, that's covered by the ACEs approach as well. There's the right to the highest attainable level of standard of health, the right to be protected from harmful drugs, whether it's learning about the effect of drugs or whether it's parental drug misuse. It's all there within the UNCRC. And so I think that certainly the conversations that we're having around ACEs in Scotland provides, for me, a really positive opportunity to raise awareness of the rights that children and young people have, and the rights that are soon to be enshrined into law in Scotland, make them binding for children and young people.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just go back to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and just go back a step, if I may? Could you just give us a little bit of history about this and how it came about? But it's a bigger question actually. But how because it's been around for a long time. I mean, we're talking 30 years ago, and now we're getting to this point here in Scotland. Can you just give me a little bit of history around it?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child actually took a really long time to write, and you can trace it back almost back to the Magna Carta, I think, in a way, when it was first recognised that by virtue of being a human being, everybody has fundamental rights. But there was a lot more kind of emphasis on human rights after the Holocaust and after World War II, and a real kind of everybody galvanized, everyone got together and said this must not happen again. There mustn't be a repeat of these horrors. And so that's when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted in 1948. And that kind of set out fundamental rights, fundamental freedoms that everybody has just because they're a human being. But there was also recognition way back in Victorian times of the kind of the wrongs of child labour, the fact that children are more vulnerable, they're more dependent on others to uphold their rights. There's long been a kind of conversation about children's rights. But soon after the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, then countries got together and thought, right, okay, we need to have a convention, or we need to have a treaty for children. But it took all the way from the Second World War right up to 1989 for the UN Convention to actually be drafted and agreed. But after that slow start, it's become the most widely ratified, so the most widely signed up international human rights treaty in the world. And as many people on this call will know, it's actually every single country in the entire world has signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, apart from the United States of America. And so it's real recognition, I think, of children as rights holders, children who have the right to their own dignity, who have the right to be involved in decisions that affect them, who have the right to additional protections to protect them from harm, but also to be kind of real active agents in their own lives. And it's all set out within the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it's a very, very powerful kind of international instrument for children and young people.
And I'll come to Mary in just a second, but from the person on the street who's just hearing about this now, what does it actually practically mean for Scotland? So what are the benefits of us leading this?
So at the moment, then Scotland, through the UK, is kind of a signatory. It's ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but it's in international law and it's not in Scottish law. So that means that governments need to think about it. The Scottish government, when it's coming up with new legislation and new policy, needs to think about it, but it's not actually binding. So if children and young people's rights are breached, there's nothing that children and young people can do. What Scotland is doing at the moment is actually, it's called incorporation. So it's incorporating the text of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scottish law. So this means that children and young people's rights will be binding in law. So it means right at the beginning of any policy making, any legislation, then the governments need to think about children and young people, and they need to actually comply with the rights, the 42 rights that are in the convention. It has happened in a number of other countries. So other countries such as Norway, Sweden, Iceland, they've incorporated the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into their law. And we have seen in these countries that there's been a real culture change in the way that children and young people are viewed. And they're involved more in decisions. There's more child-friendly policy, there's more child-friendly decision-making. So that's the path that Scotland's aspiring to go towards. But at the same time, the bill that's been introduced to our Parliament is absolutely world leading, because it's not just about kind of making sure that children can go to court if their rights are breached. Because actually, in Scotland, we really don't want children and young people's rights to be breached in the first place. There are lots of parts to the law that ensure that children's rights are protected from the outset. That they're the first thing that MSPs think about when they're making a law. They're the first things that civil servants think about. And importantly, they're the first things that budget holders think about when they're allocating resources, whether it's to social care, whether it's to education. And so the idea behind what's happening in Scotland is that we do everything we can to stop children's rights from being breached in the first place, but also make sure that if they are, there's something that they can do about it, and they have got somewhere to complain if their rights are breached.
And Mary, how exciting is this, if that's the right word, for you and for your organisation, and the effect it will have on the way that we view ACES through this human rights lens? I mean, it sounds like there's work still to be done, but wow, it could change the way that we view children's rights, hopefully forever. I've got you on mute there, Mary. Just sorry. It's okay.
Yeah, no, it is exciting, Gary. And I would just say, as you listen to Juliet there, I do think we have to say how fortunate, how amazingly lucky we are in Scotland to have someone with Juliet's passion, but also her detailed technical knowledge. And she'll blush when I say this, but Juliet and together have absolutely led the work to incorporate UNCRC. It's taken years, it's taken blood, sweat and tears. And I just, as I listened to Juliet outline the history of that and what that means and how that is implemented in practice, I'm struck by how fortunate we are to have someone with her depth of technical knowledge in the country. So I just wanted to say that, because I think we need to recognise that level and how lucky we are. But for us, it's an absolute, it changes everything, doesn't it? Because it allows us, for Children First, for example, it allows us to think about our work, not just as doing the right thing by children and families, but also implementing their right to make sure that those right things are delivered. So it allows for us, for example, I talked about our core purpose and our passion is that all children have the right to remain safely within their own families, to be brought up by their own families and communities. And Article 18 talks about that right, and I'm not going to get into the technical bits because Juliet's the expert, but it does say I have the right to be brought up by my parents if possible. What that means for organisations like mine as we try and create the policy conditions and the legislative conditions, as we try and influence people, politicians and the public in general to think differently, it means that we can use that and hold people accountable for the services that they deliver. We can encourage children to claim those rights. We can use language that makes sure that they're aware of what those rights are. And it just allows us at Children First and other organisations like us to just feel really, I think we're empowered now. We're also accountable, but it allows us to share agency with the children and young people and the families that we support. We can encourage them as rights holders to claim those rights, to ask the agencies that they engage with to, hold them up and be accountable where they don't. So it allows us all sorts of opportunities to be able to transform the systems that children find themselves in. If we put if we think about the amount of children in our country that suffer adversity through poverty, through abuse, through neglect, through systems that blame them and shame them and judge them rather than understand their rights and the experiences that we've had. Having a framework through the UNCRC allows us to argue and hold up that right to recovery. It allows us to look for solutions that will transform systems so that they're more rights focused and rights based. So it excites us because we're really interested in transformation and redesigning systems to make them more child-centred and more family-minded. And the UNCRC will offer us so many opportunities to redesign the ways in which we support some of the most vulnerable children, all children, but some of the most vulnerable children who have their rights compromised all the time in Scotland.
And how do you think it will change the direction of the conversation as far as ACEs is concerned, if we're looking at ACEs through the human rights lens? Will it take the conversation in a different direction, do you think?
I mean, I'm fascinated on Juliet's thoughts on this one, actually, because to me, it was always a rights-based conversation. It was always about the right to recognition, that what happens to all of us when we're children impacts on all of us throughout our lives, and that we really need to not turn away from children's pain. We need to be able to face it, we need to be able to understand it, and we need to do that in order to be able to prevent it and repair and recover from it. So it was always a rights-based conversation for me. I'm fascinated in Juliet's take on this because I think what happened was sometimes when new things emerge, when new ideas emerge, it triggers us on big questions for us all individually and collectively, and depending on our own circumstances. Certainly what we find with my colleagues and with the people that we support is the first place you start is you go, what happened to me when I was a child, and how does that lead me to this work, and how does it impact on my ability to do this work? And I always talk about sort of personal trouble and how that filters into public issue. And I think ACEs is a bit like that. Because it impacts on all of us, it either becomes something that we turn away from because it makes us anxious about our own experiences, or it galvanizes us and empowers us to step into children's experience, to get curious about what's happened to us, to understand ourselves, but also to understand collectively our culture and how we might have developed some of the systems, some of the laws, some of the ways in which we've designed supports around children. But so I think I think it's really unhelpful when we start pitching this as a thing on its own. The prevention of adversity in childhood, the recovery from painful events, whether it's child abuse or whether it's loss and grief through COVID, or whether it's living in poverty with parents who also have had unresolved trauma in their childhood and have developed unhelpful strategies to cope and end up in the criminal justice system. These things are all interconnected, and putting a children's rights frame around that really helps us understand it in a way that offers solutions so that we can overcome some of those things. But I mean, I don't know what Juliet's probably more, she's got more technical knowledge about it, but in me, that's what it means in practice. That's the opportunity it offers us.
Okay. Juliet, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and it makes me reflect on something that the Scottish Youth Parliament did here in Scotland. That they wanted to look at adverse childhood experiences. They wanted to produce a guide, and they didn't know how to approach it. And it was around the same time that they were actually really strongly campaigning for the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to be brought into Scots law. And there was a particularly strong member of the Scottish Youth Parliament who's really passionate about ACEs and about human rights. And he described human rights and children's rights as being the missing piece of the jigsaw for ACEs. And I really like that kind of description, because I'm coming at it from, I've known about human rights, and I've been kind of a human rights advocate for longer than I've known about the ACEs movement. And when I first learned about the ACEs movement, I was like, wow, this is a really good way to talk about the importance of dignity, the importance of respect, the importance of recognizing the kind of individual circumstances that every child's in. So by bringing the two together, I like the idea that it completes it completes the jigsaw, and we no longer have that kind of missing piece. And I mean, it really strikes me. I know I'm the technical geek around here, and I try not to get too geeky, but it really strikes me. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, they're international experts from right across the world, who look at how well countries are doing in their obligations under the UNCRC, for how well they're respecting children and young people's rights. And they also write papers known as general comments, and these are meant to be kind of guides for countries on what they can do to kind of better implement the UNCRC. And this is where it's a tiny bit geeky, but there's General Comment 13, which I think is just so valuable for the ACE aware nation, of the ACEs community, because in that, right at the very beginning of General Comment number 13, the UN committee sets out, and remember this is an instruction to government, it sets out that no violence against children is justifiable. All violence against children is preventable. And it goes on to talk about dignity, and about dignity meaning that every child is recognised, respected and protected as a rights holder. Every child is a unique and valuable human being. Every child has an individual personality, distinct needs, interests and privacy. And it really strikes me that you look at what this international document is, that's instructions to government, and that's kind of the legal framework that rights provides. And then you look at the energy and you look at the commitment of everybody who's involved in the ACE aware nation, and that's what they're trying to achieve. So I really want to see the two kind of come together. So we've got the legal power of rights, we've got the international recognition of rights, but we're using it to further this agenda, where we really recognise the importance of trauma-informed approaches, the importance of everybody knowing about the impact of adverse childhood experiences, and bring in the strong preventative role that the UNCRC provides in making sure that actually children are protected from adverse childhood experience, but have their right to recovery fulfilled if they do experience them.
I've got a question, right? So this is because while we've been talking, so this week, as we talk now, there is massive conversation going on about feeding children, one of the basic human rights of feeding children, and there's lots of pressure on governments and so on and so forth, and you know we get that. With that situation, and let's say if I mean, I know that Scotland's leading the way, but let's say England was doing similar to us, or let's say UNCRC was a little bit further down the road in England, what difference would that make to the conversation about feeding children? Could we take the government to court?
I think it would provide a really powerful tool that hopefully would mean that you don't have to take them to court, because you don't ever want to get to that stage. You want to use it as the kind of carrot to lead them away from breaching children's rights, and only use the stick when you absolutely have to. But I mean, the UNCRC is really clear that no child should go hungry. Every child has the right to food. Every child has the right to the highest attainable standard of living. No child should live in poverty. And so it provides a really strong legal framework to push governments to make sure that children don't go hungry. And I think it's interesting that with Scottish Government's commitment to the UNCRC, then they are providing meals to children over the holidays, which we're not seeing in England.
So do you think that that if things were different south of the border, that we wouldn't be having this debate about feeding children? You think that the power of the UNCRC would be enough for them just to make that decision automatically?
Yes, completely. Because I think the kind of the rhetoric that's going on south of the border is about parents not fulfilling their responsibilities, not feeding their child, spending their money on the wrong things rather than on the children. And I mean, we all absolutely know that that is not the case. We have that understanding that families are living in poverty. There's nothing that they can do. Parents are skipping meals to feed their children. But I think that when a government understands their obligations under the UNCRC and understands what a rights-based approach is, then they understand that irrespective of what their parents are doing, no child should go hungry. Irrespective of the kind of circumstances of the family, families should have enough money to feed their children. And that is a basic human right. And I do think the debate would be different if the UNCRC had more standing and more recognition south of the border.
Juliet, can I come in there actually?
Yeah, please.
It strikes me, and Scotland's by no means perfect in this. I mean, we have far too many children living in poverty, far too many children who are hungry, but I do think there is a different cultural attitude. And I wonder, my reflection would be just in terms of what I've watched over the past 5 or 6 years, is that the adverse childhood experiences conversation, the recognition that what happens to us in childhood impacts our whole life, means that there might be a slightly more compassionate and understanding approach to parents in those very circumstances. Because we've had a bit of a national conversation that if you are living in really difficult circumstances where you may have addiction or other difficulties, some of that might be rooted in things that were beyond your control when you were a child, and that you've not had an opportunity to recover from those. And I do wonder, and I don't want to make any huge claims about whether Scotland is more compassionate toward children, because I think in pockets we have a very long way to go. But we have had a national conversation. We have had a government who's been engaged in the conversation about adversity in childhood. We did have a programme for government in 2018, I think, that identified the prevention of adversity in childhood as a major priority for the government. I mean, there are some gaps in how they've attended to do that, but I think the intention in Scotland, the conversation in Scotland, the awareness of the impact of trauma in children and the kind of impact, the long-term impact that has on a country, has possibly created conditions whereby the two together, the understanding of that alongside the UNCRC, means that there's a slightly more, a kind of compassionate response. And I think in England, maybe although there's some great conversation in pockets, I'm not sure that it's been embraced at a policy level in quite the same way. I don't know what you think about that, because I think the two things are linked, Juliet.
Yeah, no, completely. I really think I think it is yet to be embraced at a policy level in England, and I think there are certain policies that we can see, like the benefits cap, where children aren't recognised as individual rights holders. So the benefits cap means that families can only receive benefits for 2 children, and then after that they don't receive any further benefits. And so it's all based around the family rather than actually the right of a child not to live in poverty. And so that's the reframing that, I mean, we're not there yet in Scotland, but that is the reframing that the UNCRC provides, that we look at children themselves, children and young people, as holders of the rights of people who shouldn't live in poverty, people who have the right to the highest attainable level of health, who have the right to be involved in decisions that affect them. And we're moving in the right direction in Scotland in terms of recognition of children in policy making. But there's still a long way to go in Scotland, but definitely in England and across the UK.
I think I'm going to ask a question around education. I've got a question around language, but I've got a burning question about young people. So we have these conversations, and they've been on the agenda for a long time now. Are we engaging, Juliet, with enough young people in order to form credible decisions about this stuff?
In Scotland, there's a lot of effort to engage with children and young people, but we're definitely still not reaching all the children and young people that we need to. I mean, there are initiatives in Scotland, like an annual cabinet meeting with children and young people, where children from the Children's Parliament and young people from the Scottish Youth Parliament meet with the full cabinet and the First Minister every year to discuss issues that are important to them. And one of these issues has been incorporation of the UNCRC into law. But they also talk about things, bullying in schools, how teachers speak to them, shouting, housing, all sorts of issues. But that's very top level. It's powerful, but it's top level. And I think we need to do a lot more to actually make sure that children whose voices aren't often heard are actually included in decisions that affect them. So more needs to be done to include, for example, asylum-seeking children. More needs to be done to make sure that children who are impacted by poverty are involved in decisions that affect them. More needs to be done to involve children in decisions that aren't necessarily seen as being about children themselves. And I think incorporation will help to do this. So, I mean, a good example is always transport. Then children and young people really rely on public transport. But when we have civil servants making decisions about public transport, they often don't think about children and young people. And so we need to provide that kind of link between the wider environment that impacts on children and young people and make sure that they're involved in those decisions as well. So yeah, still work to do.
Yeah. Mary, we know that there are some fantastic schools who take a trauma-informed approach right across the UK, and we've interviewed head teachers on similar programs like this. In terms of ACEs and in terms of human rights, how important is it that schools get on this as soon as possible?
I mean, I think that idea that children can understand and know their own rights and claim their rights has to start, doesn't it, in school? We have to teach children why human rights matter. When we do that, not only do we empower children to claim their own rights, but we also encourage them to understand other people's rights. And understanding rights really means being curious about other people. It means respecting other people's rights and being more compassionate and more kind. So if we were to, I think it helps, it's more than just about learning, but it helps create citizens that are kinder and more compassionate and more curious about each other. And I think in the current world in which we live, those are the types of skills that we want, the types of confidence that we want to build in children. That if you're confident and secure in your own right to be safe, in your own right to be heard, in your own right to make decisions about your own life, you're more likely to respect other people's right to do that too. So I think it starts with the whole country. This isn't just something that sits with schools or children's charities or anywhere. But if we, one of the things I think that the ACEs movement was so brilliant at doing was starting an interesting conversation for all of us about what it means to be human and what it means to understand yourself and what's happened to you. And alongside that, understanding that you have rights means that as a country, you can develop a conversation that will really help us deliver the type of culture, values, systems, supports, education system that we would want for everybody. And it helps us for children, I think, in schools. It helps think about, as you rightly say, some schools do a fantastic job. Most teachers do an amazing job. But I think they operate often in a system that makes that difficult for them. We operate in a culture and a system in education that I think makes it hard to offer and respect children's rights because the rules say something quite different. So in some ways, the UNCRC incorporation, the understanding of ACEs sits down here on the continuum. It's a fantastic thing, but we're still trying to implement that in systems that were developed, in Victorian times. Frankly, when you think about pretty much our education system and particularly in our justice system, which is something where I think ACEs and UNCRC together are really going to transform things for children and young people.
It's interesting. I interviewed 37-year-old chap this week who was care experienced, and he was telling me about being moved from pillar to post, and I've heard this story before as well. They're having 20 minutes to move from one house to another, and all his belongings put in a black bin bag, and out he went. And I've heard stories that type of practice still happens. Doesn't that mean that we've still got an awful long way to go, Mary?
I mean, I think those stories are rare now, to be honest. I think people recognise how horrific that is. I think we shouldn't forget in Scotland that the third component to this is the promise. So we've had a root and branch review of the care system, and the promise set out really clearly to children who require support from the state, to be looked after by the state at times, that their their right to live safely within their own home should be upheld. Their right to contact with their brothers and sisters has to be respected. Their rights not to be moved in the circumstances in which you describe, but rather to have the lifelong ability to maintain relationships is the other part of this. So if you put the UNCRC around ACE aware and understanding of the impact of trauma through the promise, actually, you've got the components, all the components we need to make sure that stories like that never, that never happens again, because the promise clearly takes a rights-based approach. The UNCRC allows children to claim those rights and challenge that once it's fully incorporated. But it is heartbreaking that, at times we fall hugely short. And that's never, I think the good thing about ACEs, the good thing about the whole movement, it was never about blame. It was never about, a bit like the promise, it was never about pointing out what we've done wrong in order to shame professionals who should have done better or who should have known better. The conversation I've heard, the conversations that I've taken part of, say, when you it's a bit like Maya Angelou, isn't it? When you know better, you do better. And through ACEs and understanding the impact of trauma on children, and through understanding this through a rights-based lens, we've got an opportunity to do much better. And that's what I'm really interested in. I'm interested in the chat here because it talks about, as recently as a couple of years ago, right in the midst of this conversation, actually, when the Scottish Government wanted to support schools around some of this stuff, there were schools who spent money on police officers in schools. And that really threw those of us who were kind of going, well, yeah, police have made huge strides and they're capable of delivering great relationships to children, but children don't need policed in schools. They need their well-being protected, their rights upheld, and they need to be able to learn in a safe and welcoming environment. And it seemed like an odd decision to spend that money on effectively law enforcement. And so we still get this stuff wrong despite it. I think the game changer here is UNCRC now allows us to wave it around and say, you've signed up to this, you've incorporated this fully, and it allows children to have their conversations around rights in a much easier way.
Juliet, we have an international audience with us tonight. I'm conscious that we've talked a lot about what's happening in Scotland and the UK. Are there any countries around the world that have signed up to UNCRC that we can learn from, that are doing things particularly well, are ahead of the curve? Is there a country that stands out?
I think it's a combination of countries. I mean, we've drawn really strongly from countries that have incorporated the UNCRC when we've been looking at kind of what the law should look like in Scotland. And so we've looked, for example, at Norway, because they actually incorporated the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Gosh, I think it was early 90s, maybe even late 80s. So it can't have been. Must be early 90s, about 20 years ago. They incorporated the UNCRC. So it's really interesting to see the impact that it's had in Norway. Interestingly, kind of the main learning that we've had from Norway has been around the justice system for children and young people. And that's where kind of most of the court cases in Norway, there haven't been that many, but most of the court cases in Norway have been around the justice system. We've been looking at Finland as well, because they've incorporated the UNCRC into law. But interestingly, Finland has also been looking at us, because they want to know more about our approach to children's well-being and getting it right for every child. And so I think there's always that kind of exchange where we can look at specific legal models of incorporation, or we can look at cultures of countries. And I think UNCRC incorporation, it's about the legal change and having that legal weight, but it's also about the culture change that you want with it. And I think generally we tend to look at the Scandinavian countries for that, because they're the ones who have predominantly incorporated the UNCRC, but they also are the countries that we look at where there is a culture of respect for children and young people. Children and young people are treated with dignity. They are recognised as rights holders and involved in decisions that affect them. So yeah, it tends to be the Scandinavian countries, but I would say we learn from right across the world. South Africa's got some very interesting court cases. There's quite a lot of interesting stuff going on with economic and social rights in South America as well. So we can pick and choose the best bits and hopefully bring them all to Scotland. That would be my hope.
Do you think that the work around the ACES movement, particularly over the past couple of years in Scotland, has led to some of those countries looking at us and what we do and how we're doing it? Has the ACES movement contributed that to that, do you think?
Well, I don't know, and that's because I'm such a I look at everything through a human rights lens. I'm actually coming from the kind of other perspective that I'm coming to the ACES movement from human rights rather than vice versa. So yeah, I don't know, I'm afraid.
Maybe I should ask Mary, because Mary's close to the ACES movement in Scotland. So I'll throw that question to you, Mary, if I may. Do you think that the work that's been done in Scotland allows countries to look at us with some sort of, maybe admiration's too strong a word, but with interest to see what's going on and to see what's happening at a grassroots level in communities in Scotland?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I was really lucky actually about 18 or nearly 2 years ago now. I spent a week in Salzburg with the organisation Salzburg Global that brings together delegates from across the world to talk about, in that case, many different conversations, but it's a rights-based organisation. And the week that I spent with delegates from across the world was on children's wellbeing, and particularly their emotional well-being. And we had lots of colleagues, not from Europe, but also from South Africa. We had people from South America, and it was interesting because people on that week-long conversation basically did ask. We hear that in Scotland, they admire Scotland for many reasons. Definitely as a country that's interested in international sharing of new approaches, but they did talk about this idea, particularly the Netherlands. Actually, they'd been interested in GIRFEC and then had begun to get really curious about how ACES impacted and changed the kind of policy drivers around children. Well, one of the things that Juliet was touching on there was justice and the international kind of opportunities there are for learning in Scotland. And one nice example, I think, of how we've brought that learning to Scotland, which nicely pulls together children's rights, the UNCRC, trauma responsive and recovery focused approach, an understanding of the harm that adversity in childhood does, is the Barnahouse, or literally translated as the child's house. And that's something that at Children First we've been working really hard to try and implement in Scotland. And it's basically a model which whereby after all child victims and witnesses, after they've experienced something that's been very traumatic, come to one place to tell that story and to get all their needs met, whether they're health needs, whether it's justice needs or child protection needs, and also where they get support to recover from trauma. Right now in Scotland, we have a system that doesn't respect children's rights first and foremost in order to be able to get all those needs met. We expect children to go through really traumatic experiences through the justice system that involves going to police to tell your story, having it, then having to wait ages till you get to a court building, maybe 18 months and 2 years later, by which time you can hardly recall what's happened, and you're often subject to very traumatic cross-examination. We then expect children, maybe they go to a different place to have a medical, and actually in Scotland we have a huge absence of support to help children recover. So one really great example that we've learned from Iceland and other Nordic countries is the Barnahouse model, where children, you take a rights-based approach, a trauma recovery focused approach, you put child's needs at the centre, and what's proven is when you do that, when you get it right for the child, you get better justice and protection and care of children. You also get better justice for the accused, because things happen quicker and you don't have to go through all these delays. So I think there are really concrete examples in Scotland of when we apply a rights-based approach coupled with an understanding of the impact of trauma, and we apply that to system design, we will change the way that we work with children in a whole host of different ways to make it much more effective. So that's the exciting bit about this. And you know, we have to really look for the opportunities, not to just go, right, we've ticked that box, we've incorporated UNCRC, you know, aren't we doing great? The next stage is to take all of those things and go, so if you take an ACE-informed and ACE-aware approach alongside a rights-based approach to education, what would that look like? So would we send children to school at 4.5 or 5, or would we respect their right to play and follow other countries who push back that start of formal learning and really recognise that children have a right to have that opportunity to develop fully through play before we expect them to learn formally in school? These are the big questions about this. It invites us to be really courageous in Scotland and to rethink the way we do everything, the way we do health, the way we do school, the way we do justice, the way we do care and protection, the way we do family, because actually, for me, fundamentally, a rights-based approach offers every child in Scotland all the support and help they need and their parents need in order to safely remain at home. That's a fundamental right that we fall way short of. So it puts family as the key resource in any country, and it enables the state to wrap around all the supports to address poverty, to overcome trauma, to make sure that child development is understood by all the professionals that engage with children. So those are the practical ways and the next steps, I think, that all of this combined can really push us in a new direction where we transform everything around children's needs. I always come back to that phrase that, you know, if you get it right for children in a country, you get it right for everybody. And that justice, somebody, I can't remember, it's one of my favourite quotes, but somebody read something the other day where they were saying that love is what justice looks like in public. And I love that. I think that's really important. And UNCRC ACEs, it's about justice. It's about doing the right thing and upholding people's rights.
Juliet, listening to Mary there, and her shared vision of what the world could look like going forward. What do we need to do now? What are the next steps? How do we get the message out there to the person in the street? One thing I wrote down when I knew I was doing this interview was children should be seen and not heard. And how many times did I hear that growing up in the 70s and the 80s? So, wow, where we are from, well, where we've come from there, and I'm a very youthful 50-year-old, I have to say. So it wasn't that long ago, but wow, how the world has changed. So do we still need to keep making those sort of monumental steps to get to where Mary would love us to be?
Yeah, there's a great deal more that we need to do before we get to where Mary and I want us to be. And I think absolutely key to that is raising awareness and understanding of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and all the rights that are in it. And we need to raise that awareness and understanding with children and young people so that they know they've got rights. Because unless they know they've got rights, how do they know when they're not being respected? We need to raise awareness of children's rights with parents, because I know quite often there's a nervousness from parents and they think, children's rights, what about my rights as parents? And I think we really need to kind of promote understanding that actually children's rights are all about supporting families. And I mean, I love the part of in the introduction to the UNCRC, it talks about the fact that children should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. And that's the reason why we've got these 42 rights for children and young people, is to create that atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. So I think parents need to know about what their rights are through being parents of children and what they're entitled to as well, to support their children to have this atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. And then, of course, we need to raise awareness of children's rights among policymakers and make sure that, as I was saying before, whether it's somebody making a decision about budgets, or whether it's about transport, whether it's about planning, or whether it's about prisons, everybody needs to know and understand about children's rights. I mean, this is what excites me about the ACEs movement, because with the ACEs movement behind this push to raise awareness and understanding of children and young people's rights, we've got the culture of compassion and kindness, and that the ACEs movement is just so powerfully driving. And then we've got the legal rights that actually back that up to make sure that children and young people can claim them, and that children and young people know that if they're not included in decisions that affect them, they can do something about it. And you know, practitioners know that they have to put children at the centre of everything that they do. And I just think that match, that kind of jigsaw that I was speaking about, bringing the legal power of rights, the 42 substantive rights in the UNCRC, with this push from the ACEs movement, a kind of kindness, compassion, understanding, then that's the combination of tools, that's a powerful tool that we need to really get to that vision that Mary was so brilliantly articulating.
So Mary, we're heading into our final couple of minutes now on the programme. So from your point of view, and you're, along with Juliet, a leading voice in this, what needs to happen next, do you think, from here on in? So when we shut down the cameras tonight and we go out tomorrow, what needs to happen next to progress this conversation?
That's the $1 million question, Gary, isn't it? And I think, I guess what I think is, we know enough now. I think we know enough. We know enough about children suffering. We know enough about the importance of relationships, of kindness and compassion. We know enough about the importance of rights and how we can create agency in our population. I think we know enough, and what we need to go on and do now is change things, transform things, build things differently, stop doing the stuff that's harmful. There's a lot of things that we keep on doing that we think it's too difficult, or there are too many vested interests that stop us from truly transforming the way we do things in Scotland, because we think it's just too difficult. But what I would say is, I feel, and I know loads of people do, feel incredibly optimistic about Scotland's future. I feel incredibly, even in the midst of this horrible pandemic and all of the terrible additional trauma that children will have suffered and are suffering, I think we've created conditions through the UNCRC incorporation, through our growing understanding of awareness of ACEs and the impact of trauma, through the promise, we've got a really great opportunity. If we look at those three things and design everything around children and their families and their communities' lives, we're not going to go far wrong. But there are things that immediately we need to do, we need to stop. So let's keep the conversation going, but let's move to action. Let's, every organisation, every professional, every politician, every parent, where we can, look at this and go, what would I stop doing and what would I start doing if I understood all of that and I really wanted to act on it? So there are really quick and important things. We need to address child poverty. And I know we've got some, in this series, some great conversations coming up about that. Poverty is a huge issue. And we know from our work with families that tackling poverty first and all the practical challenges that presents for children and their families allows you to get into some of the more complex relationship-based challenges that children and their families have. So we need to tackle some of those big things. UNCRC helps us do that. But yeah, we just need to move to action. We know enough now. We need to get on and do.
And Juliet, but my final question is for you. So I take it, there's still a fairly long road to go, but you share the optimism that Mary has?
Yeah, without a doubt. The Scottish Parliament should be passing the UNCRC bill before March of next year. And really, this having rights in law is the most powerful tool that we need to make sure that we respond to this call to action, that we take action. We've done enough talking, enough campaigning. Having rights in law will mean that it's time for action. And I really think that we can get Scotland to a place where the rights of children are protected, respected and fulfilled almost all of the time.
It's been wonderfully fascinating, I have to say. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. And as always, our our 60 minutes has flown by. Well, it certainly has for me. Juliet Harris and Mary Glasgow, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts and your expertise, and importantly for all the hard work that you continue to do in this area. It is very much appreciated. I'm just looking at Mary, I was just having a look at that visitor that you've got there. Oh, beautiful. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. We will be back in November, and interestingly, as Mary was saying, we'll be looking at ACEs and poverty, and we have two very special guests from UNICEF New York, Benjamin Perks and Sir Michael Marmot will be with us as well. So look out for that. Look out on all your social media and make sure you book your space. So from me, Gary Robinson, from Juliet, and from Mary and her beautiful dog, thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend when it comes, and please continue to stay safe. Good night.
Thank you.